And the main points of this peace agreement are the withdrawal of the US and coalition troops, which includes withdrawal within 14 months of the US troops and a reduction of the troops from 12,000 to 8,600 within the next 135 days, beginning with the signing date. Another important point is the prevention to use Afghan soil against security by maintaining groups or individuals on Afghan soil to bring the security of the United States in danger. And another, or the last very important point is the intra-Afghan peace dialogue, which is set for the 10th of March, but is still without any results. So now we have the situation that the US troops are going, the Taliban might come back, and the government of Afghanistan, the people are ignored or left out. And it's very interesting for Afghans, especially for Afghans, to know what brings the future. And I would say I'm done with this presentation. I hope that Ms. Jamila Afghani can give us as a voice, as an Afghan voice, an answer to that, especially from the perspective of women in Afghanistan. And I would like to give back to Christoph.
Thank you very much, Weiss, for this insightful introduction. There's one question sent to us by Facebook, which I would like to pose to you, which is, what do you think? How will the future politics or the peace agreement shape?
Sorry, so I didn't hear your question.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So the question is, how will
now it's freezing. Your screen is freezing.
Oh, that's a problem. So the question is, how will the future politics and or the peace agreement shape up, especially as Rani and Abdallah say the recent attacks were sponsored by foreign hands? Can you comment on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think our guest, especially Dr. Nimad, is more is the right person, is a better person to answer that question. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. That's fine. That's fine.
It's a very interesting question. Yeah.
We'll keep the further the other questions to the following speakers. And Weiss, thank you very much for this insightful introduction. And we will now, bye-bye, we will now virtually move to Kabul, where Jamila Afghani is based. Jamila Afghani is an award-winning feminist activist and director of the women's rights organization Medica Afghanistan. She will be speaking about the concept of Islamic feminism in Afghanistan and the work of her organization. During her input, we will be showing two images that illustrate Medica Afghanistan's work. And you can, as already partly been done, always send your questions during her input via the Zoom and the Facebook chats. All right? So let us now connect with Kabul, and we very much hope that the internet connection is going to be fine. When we tried, it was medium well, but let's hope for the best. Jamila, can you hear us? One moment, we'll try. Jamila? still trying to connect to Kabul. And so far, we can't hear Jamila. This is, by the way, Jamila. At least we have an image, but now we hope to be able to hear her as well. At the moment, it seems not to be possible. We'll give it a try in a minute, and I suggest in the meantime, just a moment, in the meantime, as we would be speaking to Kabul, we want to take you on a brief virtual journey to the capital of Afghanistan. The amazing British Afghan filmmaker and photographer Khyber Khan's piece Streets of Kabul will enable us to grasp some impressions of the city and its people. So we can watch the video first and then hope to re-establish a good connection with Jamila.
Hello?
Let's pause it. Yeah. Hello, Jamila. Jamila, can you hear us now? There was a short time frame when we had a good connection. Right now it doesn't seem to work, yeah? Jamila, can you hear us?
Yes, I do hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
So I suggest just to give you the floor and you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Tonight they are very bad internationally, so I'll not turn on the camera. Is it okay?
That's fine. That's perfectly fine.
That's good. First of all, thank you very much for giving me this space to be on. I appreciate it. And going to my present, I would like to give you a little bit overview of women's rights situation in Afghanistan. Taliban ruled Afghanistan from 1996 until 2001, a period in which women were essentially invisible in public life. They were barred from going to school or working. Afghanistan is the longest war in history of America. There is an international military campaign in Afghanistan immediately after 9/11, with support of World Peace, was stated the need to improve women's rights in Afghanistan as a justification for their intervention. On daily basis, people in Afghanistan after the past 10 years, still people are injured, especially the recent violence attack on maternity hospital and a funeral ceremony and shocked all Afghanistan, not only Afghanistan, the whole community. So when the conflict is going upon women or for sure they are getting affected by the ongoing, and these violence has a very serious concern for
All right. As the connection seems to be very weak, we suggest the following. We'll be asking Jamila to send us a voice message with her presentation, and we will play this voice message to all of you later. And for the moment, we'll be continuing with this video on Kabul, which we have shown to you, and then continue with Dr. Ursula Nemat as the next speaker. And I will, in the meantime, speak with Jamila so she can send everything as an audio to us, and we'll play it later. Right. This video was produced by Khaibar Khan, a UK-based British Afghan filmmaker and photographer, and later we'll be showing more of his images and videos about the overwhelming landscape of Afghanistan. Now we changed the program because of the very weak connection, internet connection from Afghanistan to Germany. And we will now speak with Dr. Orzala Nemat, an internationally known Afghan scholar, think tank leader, and activist. She's an expert in political ethnography, holding a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. And she's currently, as she told me, stranded in California. And so, yeah, let us talk to Ursula now.
Thank you, Christoph. Assalamu alaikum. Good day, good morning, good evening to everyone who is listening. I hope you have my voice. I can see that you have my camera. Okay, perfect. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. I would like to start with thanking both organizations, Al-Sharq and Disorient, for such an excellent panel in terms of timing and in terms of the importance of such discussions, particularly in the time that potentially some of us, probably not me, I have to confess, but some of us may have a little bit of more time to spend on virtual world, avoiding travels due to COVID-19. So it's great that we are having this conversation. And in terms of my talking points, what I would like to highlight here is to start with actual title of the panel by organizers in terms of Islamic feminism in Afghanistan and the US-Taliban talks. So with regards to Islamic feminism, I have to say, following colleagues' full presentation on the Afghan history, is that when it comes to feminism and whether women's movement in Afghanistan identify themselves as feminists or Muslim feminists or not is a very interesting subject to talk about. Just before I go to this question, I would like to highlight, because audience did not have the opportunity due to bad internet connection to hear our wonderful colleague Jamila Jan Afghani's presentation. So very briefly, for contextual understanding, the struggle for women's rights and women's movements in Afghanistan goes back to 100 years. Afghanistan and Afghan women have been at forefront of reforms, democratization processes throughout the history of Afghanistan, the contemporary history of Afghanistan. We have a phase in the prehistory, in very much older days and years, where we had strong women scholars, we had women poets, we had women quite active in the social fields. Rabia Balkhi is an example, Mahjouba Hirawi is an example. And then historically speaking, if you go further down, earlier, there were women who were not probably on the complete lead, but as wives and as daughters of different leaders have played, or mothers in cases of different leaders, have played critical role in the Afghan history, and their names are mentioned. We have Nazo Ana, Zarghuna Ana, we have Malalai of Maiwand, who was very actively, for example, fighting in the Afghan Anglo wars, because the history of Afghanistan is full of wars and in contests. So within the context of war and violence, women also at least raise their voice for independence of Afghanistan and their voice for justice. So there is that historical perspective that often our audience internationally are not much aware of. When it comes to the most recent context as well, throughout the 40 years of war, women have played a very important role, a non-violent role, I would say, in the history of the 40 years of war and violence. During the periods, I will not go back to the history as our colleague earlier presented, but just very briefly, Throughout the years, whether as political activists, as non-violent political activists during the Soviet invasion, women were put in prison because they were demonstrating, protesting the invasion of the Soviets on Afghanistan. Following to that, during the civil war and regional wars that Afghanistan was dragged into, despite the fact that women became the prime victim of horrible, violations and violences, they have been quite active in delivery of humanitarian services. In the women and the NGOs played an important role. Women in different humanitarian organizations were quite active in social field. Not much in the political field, I have to say. But then the Taliban took over in '96, and throughout that period, a woman became really sort of completely ignored, not only in the political field but also social field. Lots of restrictions were put in place by the Taliban forces at the time to ban the schools. I'm sure everyone is aware of these stories from the Taliban time, where women could only be doctors, and in that also under context that they should have been accompanied by a male relative to go there. So that's sort of to remind everyone that the history of Afghan women's struggle is not limited to the post 2001 context. So one thing that, if you look at the nature of women being active, as I mentioned, in different periods and phases of history, women have been quite active in different contexts. But when it comes to using different identities, it's interesting discussion and maybe requires further sort of thinking about, is that we are quite sensitive in terms of our history of isms in Afghanistan, whether it is Islamism or communism or socialism and so forth. And in that way, in the post 2001 context, I would say it's very few among Afghan activists and leaders who will call themselves a feminist or who will call themselves a Muslim feminist. So we have to also remember that not every Afghan woman who is active is a Muslim feminist. We are a Muslim majority country, that's without any doubt. But then we preferred, I can say this in a general way, but of course there are particular cases. We can say that in general, women have preferred to stay away from feminist word, but then in practice be active more, to be more inclusive of bringing secular and non-secular Muslims around the same table and actually focus on women's rights issues as opposed to the isms that give us a specific or a particular identity. Now, that's more about the sort of the women in Afghanistan, their active role throughout the years. Even during the Taliban time, I have to say that women have been quite active in the social fields. They have find their ways of resistance and resilience through organizing different educational activities in their houses. I myself was involved in organizing literacy classes for women in different neighborhoods in Afghanistan in an underground way, because of course the Taliban were not aware. Have they been aware of our activities? It could have serious consequences for myself, for my family, for people and colleagues who are involved with me in these activities. So that's one side of the story. The other side that I can see, there was also a request from me to talk about, the Taliban and what the sort of so-called change of Taliban mean in the current context. And in that regard, I mean, the history of Taliban and how they were established is known to most people. Taliban became an active movement in the 94-96 period, and this was a time that majority of those mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviet invasion started to be engaged in the power grabbing infighting in the country, in looting the country from north to south, east to west, central, and everywhere. And this became like a story, the narrative that, oh, we are the students of madrasas and we just are here to bring stability and all that. Unfortunately, in that period as well, there are little evidence that shows that this was a real, genuine local movement, because a movement that is grassroots cannot come with very sophisticated weapons and sophisticated cars, 4x4s, all new models and all that, people who are well aware of, the prices and everything back then and even now. So that can also tell you that the Taliban were not a genuine and local movement coming out of the Afghanistan's reality. There was a sort of a merge of bringing some people. Of course, the ground forces were the Taliban, but the thinking behind the movement from the very early days was directly taking us and was directly rooted to the Cold War. It was rooted to the regional competition of different regional countries in Afghanistan, using the land as a kind of a center for conflicts and competitions of different regional powers. Because between a period of 1990 or 1989, when the Soviets left, and all the way to 2001, there was this period that Afghanistan was sort of left by themselves, and then the US and the rest of the Western allies who supported Mujahideen in the earlier days would just sort of abandon Afghanistan. So in that context, what I can say is that at least in the period that they were ruling, there was much less violence because there wasn't any energy or force left to resist them at that time, with an exception of few pockets of resistance in some parts. But then it was only after 9/11 that the Taliban, were the center of attention by international forces, and as a result, the 9/11 happened, and the military intervention resulted in collapse of the regime. Now, whether in the post-2001 context, and as we speak now, it's like almost nearly 20 years, the Taliban have changed as a movement or not, my answer to that is that unfortunately, yes, they have changed, and the change is not a positive one, because the Taliban movement in the past was identified only as a force that brings some level of security, but sacrifice entirely half of the population for that security that they brought in, as security of like a physical, that you would feel safe when you go out. But that was with a very high price of ignoring completely half of the population of the country being women. Now, in the post-2001 context, gradually after they have sort of reimagined their insurgency activities, they become one of the most radically aggressive and most radically violent groups that are known around the world. I'm hardly hearing any other forces, even including the similar to Taliban sort of forces, that they will target like newborn children. They have that in Afghanistan. I hardly hear of anti-state groups and organizations committing such sort of suicide attacks that can have massive civilian casualties. Not only the military and the government forces, but the civilians are the prime target. Every year we have reports that is verified through different sources by UNAMA, and this report is highlighting civilian casualties and how they are increasing to its worst. So in the current context, as we speak, one of the key indicators to define the Taliban is a massive level of violence and fear that they are identified with. And that comes from a reality of this only one resort that they can use to maintain power, because it seems that in the current context of 2020, the Taliban are no longer the peace bringers. They are actually a very violent force that are using all kind of unacceptable rules and principles in order to bring in order to gain back the power that they think they were deprived of back in 2001. And so that's more about the changes. And of course, they will make excuses that, this recent incidents are not us, it is Daesh. But for those of you unfamiliar, in the context of Afghanistan, there is not a very clear line of separation between who the Taliban are and who the Daesh are. They are both, two sides of the same coin. When it comes to their regional and their global supports, I think there is little difference between them. When it comes to their actions and activities in the country, very different, very difficult to make a distinction of which attack, which suicide attack, which attack that caused massive, civilian casualties, and the most horrifying part is done by whom among the two groups, ISK or the Taliban. Now, why the Taliban becomes so violent is also important. They're identifying themselves as the forces that are fighting this so-called occupation. Was this an occupation